right, let's jump into the world of Huey P. Newton. This guy was a major force in the Black Panther Party, and you've given us some really fascinating stuff to dig into. We've got his own essays, his writings, and even a conversation he had with these super well-known psychologists. I'm excited to see what we find.
It really is amazing how these sources let us trace how his thinking evolved, starting from his early life and going all the way to his big ideas about changing the world.
It's true. We've got Newton's essays and writings to give us a direct look into his revolutionary beliefs, and then there's this incredible dialogue between him and the psychologist Eric H. Erickson. They go deep into stuff like identity, revolution, even the future of humanity.
It's a truly unique mix that reveals unexpected links between revolution and psychology.
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is to understand Newton's vision for social change. We'll explore his concept of revolutionary intercommunalism and see how his ideas still resonate even today. But first, let's start with his early life. It seems like growing up in Oakland had a huge impact on his views.
Oh, definitely. Newton's upbringing exposed him to poverty and injustice firsthand. He saw the realities of racial inequality in America, and those experiences really fueled his later commitment to revolution.
In his writings, one thing that stood out to me was how he compared his own childhood to that of white middle-class radicals. He really highlighted how much more real and urgent his own oppression was.
Exactly. For him, politics wasn't some theoretical or abstract thing. It came from a very real need to secure basic things: food, shelter, safety for himself and his community. It's such a different perspective from those who might see revolution as some kind of intellectual exercise.
Yeah, very different. Okay, this brings us to the Black Panther Party. Now, their focus on armed self-defense was, to put it mildly, controversial, but it clearly resonated with a lot of people at the time. I mean, that, quote, "the racist dog oppressor fears the armed people. They fear most of all black people armed for self-defense." That's powerful stuff.
It really reflects the atmosphere of fear and violence that Black communities were living in. The constant threat of police brutality, the lack of protection from the state. These were everyday realities that shaped the Black Panther Party's approach.
And we have to remember, Newton didn't see the gun as the answer to everything, right? He ultimately wanted to abolish war, but he also believed that you needed to be ready to defend yourself.
Absolutely. He saw the gun as a way to challenge those in power, to force them to acknowledge the reality of oppression. But it's crucial to understand the historical context here. We can't separate this perspective from the deep-rooted racism and the denial of basic rights that fueled it.
It's interesting how he criticized the very idea of democracy when it came to black people. He argued that the system wasn't actually serving their interests.
He saw through the limitations of a system that claimed to represent everyone while ignoring the very real marginalization of entire communities. That disillusionment, combined with the urgency of their situation, pushed them towards more radical solutions.
Okay, let's dive into the core of Newton's vision, his idea of revolutionary intercommunalism. I'll admit, this one's a bit complex for me. It goes beyond national borders and tries to grapple with global interconnectedness.
Yeah, it was a big shift from his earlier focus on Black nationalism. Newton realized that in a world where everything is interconnected, the fight for liberation had to go beyond national boundaries. It had to be global.
There's this part in his writings where he really takes apart the whole idea of isolated nations. He argues that American imperialism has basically turned the world into a network of interconnected communities, all fighting against the same oppressor. That's a bold statement.
He understood that nationalism had its limits, especially in a world where economic forces, technology, and American influence had reshaped everything.
So what did revolutionary intercommunalism actually look like in practice? What was he envisioning?
He saw a future where communities had control over their own resources and institutions, where they worked together to dismantle the global power structures holding them down.
So a world where wealth and resources are shared fairly, where people work together for the common good, and the idea of nation-states fades away. Incredibly ambitious.
It is. It requires a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves and each other. We have to move past artificial divisions of race, nationality, and class. And this is where his idea of pseudo-species comes in. It's this tendency humans have to form groups based on superficial differences.
Wait, hold on. I'm a little lost with this pseudo-species idea. Can you give me an example of how that plays out in the real world?
Okay, imagine two groups of fans at a football game. Each one is totally convinced that their team is the best, right? They start to see the other side as the enemy, even though they both love the same sport. They create this artificial division based on something pretty superficial. That's kind of like pseudo-species in action creating us versus them dynamics that lead to conflict and prejudice.
Ah, okay, I see what you mean. So how did Newton think we could overcome this tendency to divide ourselves?
He believed that education and conscious effort were key. He thought that by understanding these false divisions and working to dismantle them, we could move towards a more inclusive and interconnected future.
That makes sense. But even while he was criticizing this pseudo-species behavior, Newton was also dealing with the challenges of leadership within his own movement. He warned against becoming a revolutionary cultist, someone who thinks they're better than the people they claim to represent.
You're right, that's a crucial point. It brings up questions about the role of leadership, the need for accountability, and the potential dangers that can pop up within any movement, even one that's fighting for a just cause. It's a reminder that power can be easily corrupted, even with the best intentions.
So he was basically saying that true revolutionary leadership requires humility, self-awareness, and a genuine commitment to something bigger than yourself. Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Definitely a lot to consider. There's still much more to explore, including his ideas about education and how his own experiences shaped his vision for a revolutionary approach to learning. Picking up where we left off, I think we really need to dig into Newton's ideas about education. He was a firm believer in the power of ideas and education to really, change the world.
You're right. For Newton, it wasn't just about picking up a gun. It was about picking up knowledge. He saw education as absolutely central to revolution. I mean, he even said the main purpose of the vanguard group should be to raise the consciousness of the masses through educational programs and other activities.
Yeah, that's a great quote. He saw education as this key to unlocking people's revolutionary potential. It was about giving people the tools to understand how they were being oppressed, to really analyze those systems at play, and to imagine a different future.
That makes me think about how critical he was of the traditional education system. Didn't he think it reinforced the existing power structures instead of challenging them?
Absolutely. He felt like traditional education, especially when it comes to Black and marginalized communities, it often indoctrinates people into accepting the status quo. He wanted an education that empowers people, liberates them, encourages them to think for themselves.
So how did he envision that kind of education happening?
Well, look at the Black Panther Party themselves. Their survival programs like the free breakfast for children and their health clinics, they weren't just about meeting those immediate needs. They were about showing people a different way of doing things, a model for community empowerment.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like they were putting their ideology into action, proving that by working together, they could address the needs that the system was ignoring.
Exactly. And it was a way to build trust within the community and show people the real tangible benefits of their vision.
Speaking of challenging the system, Newton was really fascinated by the idea of contradictions, wasn't he? He saw revolution as this ongoing process fueled by the inherent contradictions within society. Like it's almost built into the system itself.
That's a great point. It's a concept rooted in what's called dialectical materialism.
Hmm.
It's the idea that change happens because of this clash between opposing forces. Think of it like a pendulum swinging back and forth. The struggle between the old and the new, between the oppressor and the oppressed, that's what drives progress.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So the more tension and contradiction there is, the more potential for change.
Exactly. And Newton applied this thinking even to the Black Panther Party itself. He acknowledged that they had their own internal contradictions and that they needed to constantly evaluate themselves and evolve.
It's kind of amazing how self-aware he was. He understood that revolutionary movements can't just stay frozen in time. They have to adapt and change along with the world around them.
It shows a lot of humility and a willingness to learn and grow. He understood that clinging to dogma could be dangerous and that being open to new ideas was essential. Honestly, that's a lesson that any group or organization could benefit from, especially if they want to create meaningful change.
It's funny because we were just talking about how Newton was so wary of those revolutionary cultists, the people who get caught up in their own egos and lose sight of who they're supposed to be serving. I guess that self-awareness was his way of guarding against that.
I think you're right. It was about staying grounded, staying connected to the community, and always remembering who the revolution was really for.
So let's circle back to this idea of pseudospecies and what it means for the future. This is where Newton's conversation with Erik Erikson gets super deep. It's like they go right to the heart of human conflict, exploring how we create these artificial distinctions that lead to division and violence.
Remember what Erickson said. He describes pseudospatiation as the tendency of human beings to form groups based on artificial distinctions. And that idea is so relevant to what we're seeing in the world today.
Oh, I know. It seems like everywhere you look, there's polarization and tension and conflict. It's like we're constantly othering people who are different from us.
What's really interesting is that both Newton and Erickson, despite coming from very different backgrounds, they saw this as a huge obstacle to human progress.
So Newton, coming from his revolutionary perspective, saw pseudospecies as a tool used by the powerful to keep the masses divided. He believed that if we could dismantle those false distinctions, we could build real solidarity across differences.
And Erickson, looking through the lens of psychology, he saw pseudospecies stemming from this basic human need to belong. But he warned that this instinct could be manipulated to justify oppression and violence.
It's almost like they're both urging us to wake up and see through those narratives that tell us we're inherently different and opposed to each other.
Exactly. It's a call for empathy, understanding, recognizing our shared humanity.
Okay, this leads us to something that's always been a huge source of debate. Newton's views on violence, nonviolence, and the role of armed struggle. I mean, the, quote, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun is pretty hard-hitting.
It is. But it's important to understand the context. He wasn't advocating for violence for the sake of violence. He was speaking from the experience of a community that was constantly under threat, denied basic rights facing violence from the state.
Right, so he saw armed self-defense as necessary, a way to protect themselves when no one else would.
Exactly. And he even drew a distinction between self-defense and aggression. He argued that revolutionary movements should only act in defense of the people's interests, never as the aggressors.
He also believed that just responding to violence with nonviolence could actually lead to more exploitation.
He did. And that's a stance that has always been controversial. But it's crucial to remember the historical context. He was speaking from a place of desperation and urgency. He saw the gun as a way for oppressed people to reclaim their power and agency in a system that was completely rigged against them.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue with no easy answers. But I do appreciate that Newton was willing to confront these tough questions head on, even if it meant being controversial.
Absolutely. He forced people to really think about the realities of power, oppression, and resistance. It makes his ideas really challenging, but also so relevant even today.
Okay, so before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to touch on Newton's thoughts on the role of the leader and the future of the party. He had some really interesting things to say about the challenges of leadership and the potential traps that revolutionary movements can fall into.
You're talking about his warnings against revolutionary cultism, right?
Yes. You know, where leaders get so detached from the people they're supposed to represent, and they become more focused on power and their own egos than on the movement itself. How do you think that connects to what we're talking about now?
It's all related. For Newton, it was about staying grounded and accountable. He emphasized how important it was to serve the community's needs and make sure the movement stayed true to its values.
He understood that power dynamics can get really tricky, even in movements that are fighting for justice.
Exactly. He knew that vigilance and self-critique were essential to make sure the revolution didn't turn into a new form of oppression. He was always pushing people to question themselves, their motives, to make sure they were staying true to the cause.
Wow, this deep dive has been so insightful. We've covered so much. You know, his upbringing, his political beliefs, his ideas about power and identity, and the very nature of revolution.
It is incredible how many layers there are to his thinking. He challenged so many conventional ideas about education, leadership, and community. You know, he really made people confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world.
And it's pretty amazing how much of what he was talking about still feels relevant today.
Definitely. As we head into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how Newton's ideas resonate in today's struggles for social justice and how they might even guide us as we face the challenges of the future.
You know, it really is striking how many of Newton's concerns from back then were still things we're wrestling with today. Systemic racism, the fight for economic justice, pushing back against imperialism. These are all major themes in so many modern movements.
It's true. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement. They're directly confronting state violence against Black communities, and that was such a central issue for Newton and the Black Panther Party.
And their focus on community organizing, empowering those marginalized voices, and challenging the institutions that perpetuate inequality, it all seems to line up with so much of what Newton believed in.
Yeah, it's like a straight line from then to now. And it's not just Black Lives Matter either. The Occupy Wall Street movement, with its critique of corporate greed and economic disparity, that echoes Newton's call for a more just distribution of wealth.
And that analysis he had about how capitalism has these built-in contradictions and how it exploits people and the environment, it really resonates with a lot of the critiques of global capitalism we hear today. It's almost like he was ahead of his time.
He was definitely a visionary. And then you've got the global anti-war movement, with its focus on challenging militarism and imperialism. That carries on Newton's call for international solidarity against oppressive forces.
And this makes me think back to his idea of revolutionary intercommunalism, where communities around the world unite to dismantle those oppressive systems. That vision seems almost prophetic in our hyper-connected world today.
Doesn't it? The rise of social media and global communication networks has created this incredible level of connection and awareness that Newton probably couldn't have even imagined.
It's like the world is catching up to his ideas. Look at things like the Arab Spring uprisings, the global climate justice movement, the efforts to support struggles in Palestine and Latin America. These are all examples of people power going beyond national borders. It's really inspiring.
It is, but as much as we see those echoes of Newton's ideas, we also need to be honest about the challenges of trying to apply them to today's world. There are definitely places where things get a bit more complicated.
What do you mean?
Well, take his emphasis on arms struggle. In the context of the time, it made sense, but it does raise some really tough questions about the role of violence in movements today. Is it ever justified? If so, when? How do we even decide? Those are all debates that continue today.
That's a great point. And even his concept of revolutionary intercommunalism,
Yeah.
as inspiring as it is, it doesn't really give us a concrete roadmap for how to achieve that level of global unity in practice.
Yeah. There are so many practical hurdles to overcome. Navigating different ideologies, dealing with cultural differences, and just the sheer complexity of global power dynamics.
It really makes you realize just how messy and challenging real social change really is.
It does. But I think one of the most powerful takeaways from Newton's legacy is this unwavering commitment to challenging the status quo. He never stopped questioning those assumptions and fighting for a more just and equitable world.
That's what makes him so compelling. He wasn't afraid to push the boundaries and make people uncomfortable.
A true revolutionary. And his call for critical thinking, self-reflection, and constantly striving for progress, even when you're up against huge obstacles, that's a message that I think speaks to everyone, regardless of what you believe.
It's about each of us taking responsibility for the role we play in these systems that we live in, and then challenging those things that divide us, and actively working towards a future where everybody truly has a chance to thrive.
So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive into the mind of Huey P. Newton, I want to leave you with this thought. What role do you see for yourself in carrying forward the spirit of his vision, whatever way makes sense in your own life, in your own community?
Yeah, it's a powerful question to consider. Newton's legacy reminds us that we can all be active participants in shaping the world we want. We don't have to just stand by and watch. Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been amazing to explore the ideas of such an influential figure of the 20th century.
And remember, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep working towards the world you believe in.